A racist teacher denies service to Snoop Dogg, but what happened next shocked everyone. The lunch rush was just winding down at Chateau Bleu, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Los Angeles. The clinking of silverware and low murmurs of conversation filled the air as patrons enjoyed their overpriced meals beneath dim chandeliers. At the entrance, Ms. Parker, the restaurant's front hostess, stood stiffly behind the polished podium, scanning the dining area with sharp, judgmental eyes. A former high school teacher turned restaurant hostess, she had carried over the same rigid, no-nonsense demeanor that had once terrorized students into submission. She had been working here for over a year now, and in that time, she had developed a reputation. A reputation for deciding, rather selectively, who was restaurant material and who wasn't. A young couple walked up to the podium, the man dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, the woman in a floral sundress. They smiled politely. "Table for two, please?" Ms. Parker gave them a quick once-over. Her lips pursed in immediate disapproval. "We're full," she said crisply, tapping the reservation book with her manicured nails. The young man glanced past her, clearly noticing the multiple empty tables scattered throughout the dining area. "But there are seats." Ms. Parker's expression turned stony. "I said we're full. Try somewhere else." The couple exchanged a look before turning away, embarrassed. Behind them, a middle-aged businessman in a tailored suit stepped forward. "Reservation for Mr. Lawson," he said smoothly. Ms. Parker's expression instantly softened into a warm, welcoming smile. "Of course, Mr. Lawson. Right this way." She personally escorted him inside, past the confused and humiliated couple, her heels clicking with authority. If there was one thing Ms. Parker believed, it was that a person's appearance said everything about them. And that belief was about to backfire spectacularly. The restaurant doors swung open again. A tall, lean figure stepped inside, moving with the effortless confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Snoop Dogg. Dressed in a sleek black button-down, a pair of designer shades, and his signature gold chain, he had the kind of laid-back aura that could make any room feel 10 times cooler. Ms. Parker didn't recognize him, not at first. All she saw was a man in baggy pants, sunglasses, and jewelry. Her entire demeanor shifted. Her lips curled into a slight sneer, her brows narrowing in barely concealed disdain. Snoop stepped up to the podium, removing his sunglasses with a smooth motion. He looked at her, calm as ever. "Yo, what's good?" he said, his voice effortlessly smooth. "I need a table for one." Ms. Parker blinked. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if she had just caught the scent of something unpleasant. "Reservations only," she said stiffly. Snoop raised an eyebrow. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the half-empty restaurant. "Huh," he said, rubbing his chin. "That's funny. 'Cause I see a whole lotta empty tables in here." Ms. Parker crossed her arms. "We have a strict dress code, sir," she said, eyeing his chain with barely concealed judgment. "We expect our guests to dress appropriately." Snoop exhaled a quiet chuckle. "That right?" He nodded slowly. "Guess I should have worn my three-piece suit today." A few customers nearby had begun to notice the exchange. Some whispered amongst themselves. Others took out their phones, recording the moment. Ms. Parker remained firm, unaware that she was being filmed. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice laced with artificial politeness. "But this restaurant serves a more refined clientele. We don't do walk-ins." Snoop took a deep breath, letting the tension settle. Then, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "You sure about that?" Ms. Parker scoffed. "Quite sure." Snoop just shook his head, amused. Then, he muttered under his breath. "Let's see how this plays out." And that's when the restaurant manager came running. The moment Mr. Caldwell, the restaurant manager, spotted Snoop standing at the entrance, his entire face drained of color. His breath caught in his throat, realization hitting like a freight train. Oh my God, the Snoop Dogg. In his restaurant, being turned away by his hostess. His feet moved on instinct. He pushed past a few waiters, practically sprinting toward the front. "Mr. Dogg," Caldwell wheezed out of breath. I'm so sorry, sir." Ms. Parker blinked in confusion. Snoop turned, smirking. "Yo, my man. How you doing?" Caldwell let out a nervous laugh, dabbing at the sweat forming on his forehead. I'm doing great. But Ms. Parker here seems to have made a bit of a mistake. He turned sharply toward his hostess, eyes wide with panic. Ms. Parker, do you have any idea who this is? Ms. Parker frowned. She glanced at Snoop again, this time actually studying him. The sunglasses, the chain, the laid-back demeanor. And then it hit her. Like a brick to the face. Her mouth went dry. Her stomach twisted into knots. The name she had just dismissed so casually suddenly screamed in her mind. Snoop Dogg. A man so famous that even people living under a rock knew who he was. And she had just humiliated him. In front of a recording audience. She swallowed hard, panic creeping into her voice. I didn't realize. Snoop tilted his head. Didn't realize what? Ms. Parker fumbled for words. I thought. Snoop leaned on the podium, staring her down with amused patience. You thought what? The room was dead silent. Ms. Parker opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was no excuse. No way out. Because the entire restaurant had seen it. The truth was already out there. The restaurant buzzed with hushed conversations. People at tables leaned toward each other, whispering. A few even pointed toward Ms. Parker, shaking their heads. Meanwhile, the recording phones in the room ensured that this moment was already going viral. Snoop turned to Caldwell. Yo, my man. You trying to tell me this ain't how y'all treat everybody? Caldwell stammered. Of course not, sir. This was just a huge misunderstanding. Snoop gave him a knowing smirk. Ms. Parker, realizing she was standing at the edge of a professional cliff, immediately switched tones. Mr. Dogg, she said quickly, forcing a polite smile. I sincerely apologize for the miscommunication. If you'd like a table, I'd be happy to. She reached for a menu. Snoop held up a hand. Nah, he said coolly. Ms. Parker froze. Snoop glanced around, his smirk deepening. I think I lost my appetite. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Ms. Parker standing there, humiliated. The room exploded in murmurs. And before Ms. Parker could even recover, she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Caldwell staring at her. His face was pale. You're fired, he whispered. Ms. Parker stood there, frozen. Her breath hitched as the words sank in. You're fired. The restaurant manager's voice echoed in her mind, but it didn't feel real. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Caldwell's face was stone cold, his eyes dark with disappointment. The murmurs from the diners around her felt deafening now. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was ruined. She had spent years judging others, deciding who was worthy to sit at these tables, believing herself to be untouchable. And now, she was the one being turned away. But, sir, she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Caldwell didn't budge. You heard me. Get your things. A waitress gasped nearby, covering her mouth. The rest of the staff stood in stunned silence, watching the scene unfold. Ms. Parker turned red. Her gaze darted to the diners, their disapproving stares cutting through her like knives. Some were shaking their heads. Others had their phones out, still recording. Her downfall wasn't just happening, it was being broadcasted to the world in real time. She clenched her jaw, gripping the edge of the podium. She had to fix this. I didn't know who he was, she tried to reason, forcing out a breathless chuckle. I thought he was... Caldwell cut her off. You thought he was what? Silence. A deadly, suffocating silence. Miss Parker's throat tightened. She knew what she had thought. And so did everyone else. Caldwell shook his head. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before locking eyes with her one last time. Get. Ms. Parker's fingers trembled as she turned away. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue. Because for the first time in her life, she had no power. She grabbed her bag from behind the counter and hurried out of the restaurant, her heels clicking against the floor. As she stepped outside, the California sun felt too bright, too harsh. She glanced around. Snoop was still there, standing by a sleek black car, talking to his driver. Ms. Parker hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to walk away. But something deeper, something uglier, whispered that she needed to say something. She swallowed her pride and took a hesitant step forward. Snoop saw her coming. He didn't look angry. Didn't look smug. He just looked amused. Miss Parker's fingers curled around the strap of her purse. She cleared her throat. I just wanted to. Snoop lifted a hand, stopping her. Nah. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Nah, he repeated, shaking his head. Miss Parker's brows furrowed. But Snoop exhaled a small chuckle. Look, lady, we both know whatever you about to say ain't really what you mean. Miss Parker's mouth opened, but no words came out. Snoop adjusted his gold chain, watching her for a moment before speaking again. I ain't mad, he said simply. I ain't even surprised. Ms. Parker felt her cheeks burn. But let me give you some advice, Snoop continued, his tone calm but firm. Next time, don't wait till you get caught to do the right thing. Her throat tightened. Snoop slid his sunglasses back onto his face and climbed into his car. Ms. Parker stood there, rooted to the pavement, as the sleek vehicle pulled away from the curb. And just like that, he was gone. Ms. Parker hadn't left her apartment in 3 days. She had deactivated her social media, turned off her phone, and pulled the curtains closed. But it wasn't enough, because the world still knew. The video had gone viral. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. She had become the face of discrimination. Her inbox was flooded with emails, from former students, from angry strangers, from people she hadn't heard from in years. Even job listings had disappeared overnight. No one wanted to hire someone who had publicly humiliated one of the world's most famous figures. Her name was toxic. Ms. Parker sat on her couch, staring at the blank TV screen in front of her. How had it come to this? How had one moment destroyed everything? Because it wasn't just one moment. It was a lifetime of looking down on people. And now, she was at the bottom. For the first time in her life, she felt exactly what it was like to be judged. And it hurt. Ms. Parker pulled her blazer tighter around herself as she walked into the corporate building. She had been unemployed for over a month now, burning through savings fast. She had no choice. She needed a job. And this was her last shot. She had applied blindly, desperate for anything that would take her. As she sat in the waiting area, she fidgeted with her purse strap. A young receptionist smiled at her. The hiring manager will see you now. Ms. Parker nodded stiffly and stood, smoothing out her blouse. She walked toward the door, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. And then, she froze. The office was sleek, modern. The desk was massive. And sitting behind it, leaning back casually in a leather chair, was Snoop Dogg. Her stomach dropped. Her legs locked. Snoop tilted his head, grinning. Well. Ms. Parker couldn't breathe. Her mouth opened, but she had no words. Snoop folded his hands together. Didn't expect to see me again, did you? The room was dead silent. Ms. Parker could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the air conditioner. She felt like she was on trial. She was on trial. Her eyes darted toward the door, but she knew there was no running from this. Snoop leaned forward slightly. So, what brings you here? Her voice barely worked. I was told there was a position open. Snoop raised an eyebrow. And you thought I'd be the one to hire you? She swallowed hard. I didn't know it was your company, she admitted. Snoop smirked. That's funny. Ms. Parker shifted on her feet. Look, I know what happened before was bad. But I need a job. I've learned from my mistakes. Snoop tapped his fingers against the desk. You learned, he asked. Or you just hate what happened to you? Ms. Parker flinched. 'Cause those ain't the same thing, Snoop continued. One means you actually changed. The other just means you mad you got caught. She bit the inside of her cheek. Snoop sighed, then leaned back, studying her for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. You start Monday. Ms. Parker's head snapped up. What? Snoop shrugged. Figure this is the best way to see if you really changed or not. She stared at him. You giving me a chance? Snoop chuckled. Let's just say I believe in second chances. He smirked. That's something you should have believed in a long time ago. Ms. Parker's throat tightened. She nodded. "Thank you." Snoop waved her off. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You still gotta prove it." Ms. Parker left the office feeling like she had just walked through fire. She had fully expected Snoop to humiliate her, to throw her out the way she had thrown him out of the restaurant. But instead, he had done something far worse. He had given her a chance. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was afraid. Not of failing. Not of what people thought of her. But of proving him right or wrong. The weekend passed in a blur. She barely slept, turning over everything in her head. Monday morning arrived too soon, and before she knew it, she was walking through the front doors of her new job. The office was sleek, modern, and far bigger than she had expected. She had assumed this was some minor gig, a desk job tucked in a corner where no one would notice her. But as she walked through the hallways, she realized just how wrong she had been. This wasn't just a job. This was one of Snoop's companies. People recognized her. She could feel it. A few employees whispered when she walked past, others threw her quick glances before turning away. She knew why. The video. They had all seen it. She made her way to the HR office, where a woman in her early 30s, dressed in a crisp white blouse, sat waiting. "You must be Ms. Parker," the woman said, offering a polite but firm handshake. "Welcome aboard. My name is Rachel. I'll be overseeing your training for the next few weeks." Ms. Parker forced a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity." Rachel gave her a look. A knowing look. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, crossing her arms. "This isn't some charity position. You're here because Mr. Broadus believes in second chances. But that doesn't mean you get a free ride. You'll work for it, just like everyone else here." Ms. Parker nodded quickly. "I understand." Rachel studied her for a moment longer before turning to her computer. "All right then. Let's get started." The first week was grueling. She had never worked in an environment like this before. Everything moved fast, and she was constantly trying to catch up. She had never felt so out of place. The people here were younger, sharper, more adaptable. And worst of all, none of them respected her. She overheard the whispers. "Is that really her? Can you believe she's working here? I don't get why Snoop even hired her." She ignored them. She had to. But what she couldn't ignore was the way she started to see herself in a new light. She had been on the other side of this before. She had been the one judging, the one assuming, the one dismissing people based on appearances. And now, she knew exactly how that felt. It was humbling. It was brutal. And for the first time in her life, she understood. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful morning, she found herself in the break room, staring blankly at a vending machine. Though, she turned. Snoop was standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same cool, unreadable expression. She straightened immediately. "Mr. Broadus?" He smirked. "So, ain't nobody call me that unless I'm in trouble." She swallowed. "Right, Snoop." He stepped further into the room, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "How's it going?" he asked, taking a sip. She hesitated. "It's challenging." He chuckled. "Could be weird if it wasn't." Silence settled between them. She glanced at him. "Can I ask you something?" He gestured for her to go ahead. "Why did you hire me?" Snoop took a long sip of his water before answering. "Because you needed it." She blinked. "That's it?" He shrugged. "Ain't that enough?" She frowned, looking away. "I don't get it. I embarrassed myself. I embarrassed you. I don't deserve to be here." Snoop tilted his head. "And yet, here you are." She clenched her jaw. "What if I mess up again?" He smirked. "Then you'll fix it. Simple as that." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "You make it sound easy." He leaned against the counter. "Nah, it ain't easy. It's work. But that's what makes it mean something." She stared at him, trying to process the weight of his words. For the first time since she started working here, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. The weeks passed. And slowly things started to change. She stopped trying to prove herself and started actually listening. She learned. She adapted. She made mistakes, but instead of ignoring them, she owned them. And people noticed. The whispers changed. She's actually putting in the work. She's not the same person from that video. I don't hate her as much as I thought I would. She still had a long way to go. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't pretending to be better than she was. She was actually becoming better. And Snoop? He just sat back and watched. Because he knew that some lessons, people had to learn for themselves. One day, months after she had first stepped into the company, she found herself walking into Snoop's office, clutching a file. He looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow. "What's up?" She exhaled. "I wanted to say something." He leaned back in his chair, waiting. She set the file down. "I get it now." Snoop smirked. "Yeah." She nodded. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. And then she did something she had never done before. She thanked him. Not just with words, but with real gratitude. Because without him, she never would have seen what was broken inside her. And without that, she never would have fixed it. Snoop grinned, nodding. "Good. About time." She chuckled. "You're not gonna make this easy, are you?" "Nah," he said, laughing. "Where's the fun in that?" She shook her head, smiling. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Months passed, and Ms. Parker kept her head down and worked. She no longer had the entitlement she once carried, the superiority that had made her believe she could judge people without knowing them. She had been on the other side now. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be reduced to nothing more than an assumption. And because of that, she changed. One morning, as she entered the office, she noticed that people no longer whispered about her when she walked by. They greeted her. They respected her. Because she had earned it. She sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, when Rachel, her former trainer, approached with a smirk. "You've come a long way," Rachel said, crossing her arms. Ms. Parker glanced up, arching an eyebrow. "You actually admitting that?" Rachel chuckled. "Yeah, I am." Ms. Parker sighed, setting her mug down. "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually like it here." Rachel grinned. "Good. Because you've got a new position waiting for you." Ms. Parker frowned. "What do you mean?" Before Rachel could answer, a familiar voice called out. "Yo, Ms. Parker. My office." Now, she turned toward the sound. Snoop stood by his door, leaning against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. She swallowed. She hadn't had a one-on-one with him in months. Rachel winked. "Good luck." Ms. Parker stood, smoothed out her blouse, and walked into Snoop's office. She closed the door behind her, heart pounding slightly. Snoop gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." She did. He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You've been doing good." She exhaled. "Thank you." "But," he continued, "I got a question for you." She nodded. "Okay." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "What's next?" She blinked. "Next?" Snoop smirked. "Yeah. What's the next step for you?" She hesitated. For so long, she had been focused on surviving, on proving herself. She hadn't really thought about what came next. "I don't know," she admitted. Snoop nodded like he expected that answer. "Good," he said. She frowned. "Good?" "Yeah," he said, cracking a grin. "'Cause that means you're ready for something bigger?" She furrowed her brows. "I don't follow." Snoop tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking for a moment. Then he spoke. "You remember the lesson I gave you that day outside the restaurant?" She nodded. "I do." "What was it?" She swallowed, remembering his words clearly. "Don't wait until you get caught to do the right thing." Snoop snapped his fingers. "That's right. And that lesson? That ain't just about you. That's about a whole lot of people out there." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Snoop leaned forward, his expression serious. "I mean, I'm about to put you in charge of something real. Something that ain't just a desk job." She felt her breath catch. "In charge?" Snoop nodded. "Yeah. I want you to run a new program. One that helps people who got knocked down get back up." She stared at him, stunned. "You want me to do that?" Snoop shrugged. "Why not? You know what it feels like to hit rock bottom. You know what it feels like to get a second chance. Ain't nobody better to run this than someone who's actually been through it." She sat there processing his words. She had spent so much of her life thinking she was better than other people, thinking she was the one judging them. And now, she was being asked to help them. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said, nodding firmly. "I'll do it." Snoop grinned. "That's what I like to hear." She smiled back. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a real purpose. The program was launched within a few months. It was called the Second Chance Initiative. Its goal? To help people who had been publicly disgraced, fired, or judged too harshly get a second shot at life. Ms. Parker threw herself into it completely. She worked with ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives. She helped people who had been canceled due to past mistakes but genuinely wanted to change. She gave opportunities to people the world had written off. And through it all, she realized something. She wasn't just helping them, she was helping herself. Because every story she heard, every person she helped, reminded her of the person she had been, and the person she had become. One day, after a long shift at the initiative's office, she received a text message. It was from Snoop. "You free? Let's grab a coffee." She smirked, shaking her head. "On one condition," she replied. "I get to pay this time." Snoop's response came back immediately. The hell must have frozen over. She chuckled, grabbing her coat and heading out. As she walked down the street, she realized something. She had spent so much time looking down on others. But now she was looking forward. And she had a legend like Snoop Dogg to thank for it. Ms. Parker sat across from Snoop in a quiet, tucked-away cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee swirling around them. She never thought she'd see the day when she'd be having a casual conversation with him, like they were just two old friends catching up. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "You know, if someone told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here having coffee with you, I would have laughed in their face." Snoop smirked. "That's so?" She nodded. "Yeah. Back then, I thought I had it all figured out. Thought I knew what people were worth just by looking at them." Snoop leaned back, his gold chain catching the light. "And now?" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Now, I realize how blind I was." Snoop took a sip of his drink before setting the cup down. "Funny how life humbles you when you least expect it?" She chuckled. "Yeah. Ain't that the truth?" A comfortable silence settled between them. The cafe bustled with quiet conversations, the occasional sound of a barista steaming milk filling the air. Then she cleared her throat. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me that day outside the restaurant." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? Which part?" "The part about how you shouldn't wait until you get caught to do the right thing," she admitted. "I've been living by that ever since." Snoop studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. That's how you know you really changed." She smiled. "It wasn't easy though. There were days when I wanted to quit. Days when I wondered if people would ever see me as anything more than that woman from the viral video." Snoop exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. "You can't control what people think about you. All you can do is keep moving forward." She nodded slowly. "I get that now." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Snoop grinned. "So, tell me, how's the Second Chance Initiative doing?" Her face lit up. "It's actually growing faster than I expected. We're expanding into 3 more cities by next year." Snoop nodded. "That's what I like to hear." "But..." She hesitated, biting her lip. "But what?" Snoop asked, tilting his head. She let out a slow breath. "There's this one case that's been sticking with me. A guy named Marcus. He came to us a month ago after losing his job. He used to work in finance, but one mistake cost him everything. He was blacklisted in the industry." Snoop's expression turned serious. "What kind of mistake?" She stirred her coffee. "Nothing criminal. Just bad judgment. He spoke out against his company's unethical practices, and they made sure he'd never work in finance again." Snoop exhaled through his nose. "Damn. Yeah," she said. "The guy's smart, talented, but no one will give him a chance. And the worst part? He's starting to believe he doesn't deserve one." Snoop nodded, thinking. "Sounds familiar." She smiled knowingly. "Yeah, it does." Snoop tapped his fingers on the table. "So what's your plan for him?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I've helped a lot of people get back on their feet, But with Marcus, it's different. He's not just struggling financially, he's struggling mentally. I see it in his eyes. He's losing hope. Snoop was quiet for a moment, then smirked. Then give him a reason to hope. She raised an eyebrow. And how do I do that? Snoop leaned forward. Show him what's possible. Sometimes people don't need a job or a paycheck first. They need someone to remind them who the hell they are. She let his words sink in, then nodded. Yeah, you're right. Snoop grinned. I usually am. She rolled her eyes but smiled. Tell you what, Snoop said, stretching his arms. Let's set up a meeting. I want to meet Marcus. Her eyes widened. Wait, seriously? Yeah, Snoop said casually. Bring him by my office next week. Let's see if we can give the man a future. Ms. Parker couldn't help but laugh. You do realize how insane this is, right? Snoop smirked. Ain't that the best part? She chuckled, shaking her head. You never stop surprising me. Snoop lifted his coffee cup in a toast. Good. That's how you keep life interesting. She clinked her cup against his, a newfound determination settling in her chest. Maybe this was what second chances were all about. Not just helping people get back on their feet, but helping them believe in themselves again. And thanks to Snoop, she was going to make sure Marcus, and many others like him, never got left behind. A week later, Ms. Parker sat in the lobby of Snoop's office with Marcus beside her. He was nervous, fidgeting with the cuffs of his sleeves. I don't know about this, Marcus muttered under his breath. What if I screw this up? She turned to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You won't. Just be yourself. He exhaled sharply, nodding. Before they could say another word, the receptionist gestured toward the hallway. Mr. Broadus will see you now. Marcus swallowed hard but stood up. Miss Parker walked beside him as they entered Snoop's office. Snoop was standing near the window, looking out over the city skyline. He turned when they entered, flashing his signature easygoing grin. Yo, Marcus, he said, extending a hand. Heard a lot about you. Marcus shook his hand, visibly starstruck. I mean, it's an honor to meet you. Snoop chuckled. Nah, I'm just a regular dude. Have a seat. Marcus and Ms. Parker sat down, and Snoop leaned against his desk. So, you used to work in finance? Marcus nodded. Yeah. For 10 years. Snoop tilted his head. And now nobody will touch you, huh? Marcus sighed. Pretty much. Snoop was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Alright, let me ask you something. You still got that fire in you? That hunger? Marcus hesitated, glancing at Ms. Parker before looking back at Snoop. I don't know. I used to. But after everything, I'm not sure if I can do it anymore. Snoop grinned. Then let's fix that. Marcus frowned. How? Snoop stood up, walking to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the desk. That's a business proposal for a financial literacy program I've been thinking about launching. But I need the right person to run it. Marcus blinked. You're serious? Snoop shrugged. Why not? You know the game. You know the mistakes people make with money. Teach him how to do better. Marcus was speechless. Ms. Parker nudged him. Say something before he changes his mind. Marcus finally found his voice. I don't know what to say. Snoop smirked. Say yes. Marcus looked down at the file, then back up at Snoop. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest. He swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Snoop grinned. That's what I'm talking about. Ms. Parker smiled, feeling prouder than she ever had. This was what redemption looked like. And she had helped make it happen. As they walked out of the office, Marcus turned to her. Why did you do this for me? She smiled. Because someone once did it for me. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding. Then I guess I'll have to make it count? She nodded. Yeah, we both will. And with that, they stepped out into the world, ready for their second chances. Days after Marcus accepted Snoop's offer, Ms. Parker found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. She wasn't just working a job anymore, she was building something. A movement. The Second Chance initiative had started as an experiment, but now, it was a force of real change. And she had Snoop to thank for that. One evening as she was leaving the office, her phone buzzed. A message from Snoop. "Swing by my place. We gotta talk." She frowned, texting back. "Is this a good talk or a bad talk?" A few seconds later, another text. "You'll see. Just get here." Ms. Parker sighed, grabbed her bag and headed out. 30 minutes later, she pulled up to Snoop's private estate. The place was massive, but not in an ostentatious way. It was sleek, modern, but comfortable. She was led inside by an assistant and found Snoop sitting in a lounge, sipping a glass of wine, music playing softly in the background. He waved her over. "Grab a seat." She did, settling onto a leather couch across from him. "So," she said, "what's this about?" Snoop swirled his glass, watching the liquid move. "It's about you." She stiffened. "Me?" He nodded. "I've been watching you these past few months. You're doing good. Real good." She raised an eyebrow. "But?" Snoop chuckled. "You expectin' a but already?" She smirked. "I've worked with you long enough to know that there's always a but." He leaned forward, setting his glass down. "You got the initiative up and running. You're helping people. But I want to know, what's next for you?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" Snoop exhaled. "You put all your energy into building something for others. But what about your future? You ever think about that?" She hesitated. 4 months, she had been focused on fixing her reputation, proving herself, and making things right. But what did that mean for her personally? "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I haven't thought about it much." Snoop nodded like he expected that answer. "Then it's time you did." She frowned. "Why does it matter?" Snoop leaned back, watching her carefully. "Let me tell you something. The people who change the world? They don't do it just by helping others. They do it by knowing who they are, what they stand for, what they want out of life." She swallowed. "I thought I wanted status. Power," she said quietly. "Turns out, I didn't even know what that meant." Snoop smiled. "Then maybe it's time to figure it out?" She sighed. "How do I even start?" Snoop shrugged. "Same way you did with this initiative. One step at a time." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she smirked. "You really love giving life lessons, don't you?" Snoop chuckled. "Hell yeah. Somebody's gotta do it." She laughed, shaking her head. "All right. One step at a time." Snoop lifted his glass. "That's what I like to hear." She clinked her water bottle against his glass, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The next morning, Ms. Parker walked into the office with a new perspective. She wasn't just here to run the Second Chance initiative anymore. She was here to figure out her own purpose. And that started with helping Marcus succeed. When she got to his office, she found him buried under paperwork, looking stressed out of his mind. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus groaned. "I haven't. This program is bigger than I thought." She smirked. "Welcome to my world." He rubbed his temples. "I mean, I appreciate the opportunity, but what if I mess this up?" She crossed her arms. "Then you fix it. Simple as that." Marcus frowned. "That sounds familiar." She grinned. "Yeah. It's something I heard from a wise man." He chuckled. "Snoop?" "Obviously." Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I just don't want to let him down." She nodded. "Neither do I." Silence hung between them. Then Marcus straightened. "You know, you and I aren't that different." She tilted her head. "How do you figure?" Marcus smiled. "We both made mistakes. Big ones. The kind that ruin lives. But somehow, we got a second shot." She swallowed, realizing how true that was. "You think we deserve it?" she asked quietly. Marcus thought for a moment. Then he nodded. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "As long as they actually work for it." She smiled. "Yeah, I think so too." For the first time, she realized that helping others wasn't just about redemption. It was about building something bigger than herself. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just fixing mistakes. She was making a real difference. Months passed. The Second Chance initiative expanded. More locations, more people, more lives changed. Ms. Parker became a mentor, not just to Marcus, but to dozens of others. She still had moments of doubt, but now? She knew how to push through them. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. One evening, as she was leaving the office, she saw Snoop standing outside, watching the sunset. She walked up beside him. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he replied, nodding toward the horizon. "Nice view, huh?" She smiled. "Yeah, it is." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Snoop glanced at her. "You proud of yourself?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." Snoop grinned. "Good. About time." She chuckled. "You ever get tired of being right?" "Nah," he said, smirking. "It's too much fun." She shook her head, laughing. As the sun dipped below the skyline, she realized something. She had spent so much time looking down on people. But now, she was lifting them up. And in doing so, she had lifted herself up too. Months had passed since the Second Chance initiative officially launched, and it was bigger than Ms. Parker ever imagined. What had started as an attempt to fix her own mistakes had turned into something so much more. Every morning, she walked into the office and saw people who had been counted out by society, people who had been fired, blacklisted, abandoned, now rebuilding their lives. And it wasn't just them. She was rebuilding too. She had gone from a woman who used to judge others without knowing their stories to someone who was giving people a new beginning. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in her office, she heard a knock on the door. "Come in," she called. Marcus stepped inside, holding a folder. "You got a minute?" She gestured to the seat across from her. "What's up?" Marcus sat down, rubbing his hands together. "I need your advice on something." She smirked. "That's new." Marcus chuckled. "Yeah, don't get used to it." She leaned forward. "All right, let's hear it." Marcus placed the folder on the desk and exhaled. "I want to expand the financial literacy program." Ms. Parker raised an eyebrow. "Already? We just launched it 6 months ago." "I know," Marcus said, nodding. "But it's working. We've helped over 500 people get out of debt, start businesses, and rebuild their careers. And I think we can do more." She flipped through the folder. His proposal was solid. Really solid. She looked up. "You've been working on this for a while, haven't you?" Marcus nodded. "Ever since Snoop gave me a chance, I told myself I wouldn't waste it." Ms. Parker smiled. "That's exactly why he chose you." Marcus hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I was thinking, maybe you could run this with me." Ms. Parker blinked. "Me?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "You've got the experience. You know what it's like to start over. And honestly, I think we make a good team." She sat back, thinking. For so long, she had been focused on fixing her past. Maybe it was time to focus on building her future. Finally, she nodded. "Let's do it." Weeks later, Ms. Parker found herself standing in front of a packed auditorium. Over 1,000 people sat before her, students, professionals, people from all walks of life, waiting to hear what she had to say. She took a deep breath. Then she began. "I used to be the kind of person who judged people the second they walked into a room." A murmur spread through the crowd. "I used to think I could tell a person's worth just by looking at them." She shook her head. "And then one day I got judged the same way. And I learned the hard way that no one, not me, not you, not anyone, should be defined by their worst moment." Silence filled the room. She looked out at the crowd. This program isn't just about helping people get back on their feet. It's about proving that we are more than our mistakes. She let those words settle before continuing. "And I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for one person who gave me a second chance." A few people in the front row looked behind them, following her gaze. In the back of the room, leaning casually against the wall, was Snoop, arms crossed, smirking. She smiled. "So today, I want to pay that forward. This isn't just about second chances. This is about what we do with them." The audience erupted into applause. And for the first time in her life, she felt proud of the person she had become. That night, at the after-party, Ms. Parker found herself standing on a rooftop balcony, looking over the city. Snoop walked up beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "That was a hell of a speech," he said, handing her one. She took it, smirking. "You think so?" He nodded. "Yeah. Almost made me tear up." She chuckled. Almost? Snoop grinned. Almost. They clinked their glasses together and took a sip. Then Snoop spoke again. You proud of yourself? She exhaled, looking out at the skyline. Yeah, she said. I really am. Snoop smiled. Good. You should be. She turned to him. You ever get tired of helping people like me? She asked. Snoop laughed. Hell nah. It's what I do. She nodded, then looked back at the city. Then maybe it's what I do now too. Snoop smirked. Took you long enough to figure that out? She laughed. Yeah. But you knew I'd get there eventually. He nodded. That's why I gave you the chance. She smiled. Because she finally understood. And this time, she wasn't just someone looking for redemption. She was someone giving it. And that was the real second chance.